Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome back. It's Tuesday. We're starting a little later today. We had some technical challenges. We're at about 7:49 now, and you are joining Pump Up the Volume, where we discuss many of the issues that Rhode Islanders are confronting on a daily basis. And as we all know, over the past few months, those issues have ranged from COVID-19 to systemic racism to injustices and other challenges that we're confronted with, economic and otherwise. So today I have with me my partners in, again, amplifying the voices of community, Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town podcast. So thanks again, Bill, for joining us. Also, Roberto Gonzalez from Steambox, Rhode Island. Happy to have Roberto back on too, a big, again, community advocate and youth advocate. And Mr. Pat Ford, founder of the Coalition Radio Network, and the individual that has given us this forum and this medium to, again, amplify the voices of communities that are often unheard. So today, as always, I'd like to, in terms of the agenda, just to better understand how this is going to flow, we're going to spend some time really getting some updates, news updates as to what's transpired over the past week. Some of those updates will essentially carry forth and pose some questions, which all of the four of us will kind of engage in discourse around those questions. And by the end of this call, we're all going to continue to point out what is outraging us and what we think next steps might be in moving Rhode Island forward. So to start, as always, Bill, would you like to lead with a kind of overview of in terms of all of the things that have transpired over the past week?
Sure. Let's start with today, where the Providence Schools turnaround announcement was put forth by the Commissioner of Education here in Rhode Island, Angelica Infante Green, and the new turnaround superintendent, Harrison Peters. And what's interesting about this is if you go back, a year ago now, to the Johns Hopkins report, that was the major story. That was sort of the light that was being shined upon injustice and inequity in Rhode Island. Hey, look, something that many of us who grew up in Rhode Island already knew, but for the masses, so to speak, hey, look at the conditions of the Providence schools and the results of the educational experience there. And when that report dropped a year ago or so, it really, I think, served as a wake-up call to a lot of the state that there were, in fact, systemic issues that absolutely required immediate attention. So today, the commissioner and the superintendent rolling out really what'll be probably, by the time it's done, a decade-long plan, but in the short term, really raising the bar on their goals, trying to get to a point where something like 90% of the students in Providence school students will graduate. They'll be amongst the top 25% in the state. They even announced plans to open a new school on the south side. So I think it's important to start there because we've been through everything with the COVID-19 crisis, all of the recent demonstrations in the wake of George Floyd's murder. But we've got to go back even to where, and for many folks, this journey began a year ago in terms of the amplified injustices around the state with the schools. We also have seen additional protests this past weekend, the Black Women's Lives Matter protest and and several others around the state that had a much smaller turnout than previous protests. And I thought that was really fascinating. I wondered if it was a bit of fatigue on the part of some folks, if it was the heat, or if in fact we're starting to realize that the pool of people who are going to be in it for the long haul and not so much just for Instagram opportunities is much smaller than perhaps that 10,000 pool of people that we saw a few weeks ago turn out at the State House. So, in summary, COVID-19 right now, yes, the numbers are trending down. I asked Dr. Alexander Scott, I think it was just yesterday, about Central Falls, Olneyville, some of the hot spots where the numbers are, in terms of percentages of confirmed positive cases, they're going down as well. But that's not to say that the crisis has been fully, tackled in any way, shape, or form. We still have this parallel situation where you have the economy reopening and some of the most vulnerable the folks who are the most vulnerable to exposure because of that economy reopening are also those who oftentimes reside in places where the numbers are spiking or were at least spiking for some time. So I think in summary, this week has been a little bit more of the same, perhaps with a little bit less of the attention that, you'd like to see. I think one last thing I'll wrap up here in 10 seconds. The Providence Plantations element of the name of the state of Rhode Island has been sort of pushed back into the forefront. And we've seen a lot of hysterics from some folks on Instagram and Facebook and talk radio who are pushing back, calling, saying anyone who wants to get rid of Providence Plantations is trying to erase history. But for the most part, I think the state is moving to a point where at least there's a little bit more mutual understanding of why why Providence Plantations as part of the name is so greatly offensive to so many.
Thanks so much, Bill. And Bill, I think you did pose a question to the commissioner, right? That seemed to have a kind of heartfelt response. Can you share more about what that question was and what the response was?
Sure. During that press conference today, the rollout of the Providence Schools turnaround plan, and there was a lot of very specific line of very specific questioning, I should say, from the reporting corps here in Rhode Island, and very good questions, very important questions about specifics. But, after 15, 20 minutes of that, I asked Commissioner Infante Green and, frankly, Superintendent Peters, are you in it for the long haul? I mean, do you love Rhode Island? Can we expect to see you stick around in Rhode Island throughout the duration of this turnaround and perhaps beyond? And the commissioner became emotional and, almost cried and basically said, hey, look, my kids are Rhode Islanders now and I'm in it as long as you'll have me. And I think that was important for people to hear because oftentimes, you think about Rhode Island in terms of especially those who come from the outside for political positions, and perhaps even with our current governor, as a launching pad for more of a national seat. So to hear the commissioner say that she is in it for the long haul, I think that adds a little bit of value to the package that they rolled out today with the Providence turnaround.
Bill, do her children attend Providence schools? Just a quick question. Sorry, Pat.
No, they attend Central. She lives in Central Falls. That's a great question. I believe they attend public school. I'm not 100%. That's a good question, though, but she does live in Central Falls. Great question.
Okay. Yeah, it would be interesting to find out because obviously, there's a greater stake if your children are part of the system that you're attempting to transform, right?
Right. Like Mayor Elorza famously
Pat,
said a year ago that his son would be attending Providence schools for sure. Yep.
Well, if I could break that down a little bit, what's interesting is that by and large, the Providence primary schools, that sort of K-3, K-5 experience, is largely fairly good. It's on average. Where things break down quickly is in middle school and, of course, into high school, where if you're not given entree into classical, life can become pretty dire pretty quickly at this point. Now, of course, I always want to preface that by saying that's not a shot at these kids at all. Quite frankly, I think I believe all kids are great kids, and I think all kids have incredible potential. It's just a question of finding out where it is and kind of unearthing it. And therein lies the principal failure of Providence and Rhode Island schools. I guess my question, not having had the opportunity to be at the press conference, are they citing now that they believe they're in the top 25%? Or is that aspirational? And are there specifics?
That's aspirational, yeah.
Right. So how? That's great. I mean, it's super duper. I'm going to be the cynical one here, Bill, because you're a positive, uplifting person, and I'm being serious. I, however, am a tired, cynical observer of the scene. What specifics, or did they give any specifics as how they were going to get there?
Not really. And I think that's what, when you break it down, the reality is that, and frankly, I don't know if they know, you know what I mean? I think that they don't know what that's going to look like. It's really not a curriculum discussion right now. And I think there's the one thing that I will say that I thought was sort of the theme of this press conference is, and in fact, Superintendent Peters remarked it a few times, that the school district has for years been adult centric. What's best for the teachers? What's best from a hiring best practices standpoint? Now it's flipping it to a point where it's student centric. At least that's the goal. So look, a lot of intangibles, but it seemed genuine. And again, you don't know this until you get to a point where there's action, but it seemed like a genuine turning point in terms of accountability from the top.
I don't doubt.
And look,
let me just jump in for a second. I don't doubt the integrity, the intelligence, the intensity of Angelica Infante Green. And Helica, I'm sorry. I don't doubt that for a moment. I never doubted Deborah. I never doubted her either. The central issue has and always will be, number one, curriculum. Number two, the school unions, because the school unions in this state have largely been intransigent. I go back to Central Falls, and Luis, I'm going back to when Central Falls teachers essentially closed the system for a while, and it all started from the question about extending the school days at Central Falls. The teachers' unions refused until there would be adequate extra compensation. And at this point in time, Rhode Island teachers are well compensated given the national average, very well compensated, particularly given their spectacular rate of failure within the school systems. Not blaming it on teachers. I'm married to a teacher. I understand the system. But I guess I just want to close off my point by saying I'm the show me guy. Let's revisit test scores in a few months and let's see where we are.
And I'm married to a teacher too, right? And there are teachers in my family, and I understand different sides of this, even the charter school side. And I will say, charter schools, maybe Roberta wants to speak to some of those solutions later as well, since there has been research out there that we've all read. But charter schools have a lottery, right? And ultimately, you can't necessarily have a system that's that equitable when you can't really supply based on the demand. And so that's more systemic, right? More of a macro view. And so when you look at public schools as being really, for some students, the only solution, the only path, my concern is that if the funding formula is not equitable, if RIDE continues to create policies for continuing credits for teachers that go on to learn new software, new lessons, and then cannot implement it because of the rigidity of curricular standards, then at the end of the day, we're not going to see any change. It doesn't matter how many people they fired. And so that's really my concern, right? We see this administration and even those that work within it time and time again, changing staff over with the assumption that if you change staff, you can have a culture shift without, again, addressing the lack of an equitable funding formula and really poor policy. So while, it was heartfelt, I would love to know, whether the commissioner's children are in public school, because I think really that's really going to set, more pressure on addressing the systematic issues and challenges that Rhode Island continues to face. And that's just my perspective on it, right? Unless those two areas are really transformed and really kind of targeted, I think we're going to run into the same. So Roberta, what are your thoughts?
I don't have the same courage as the commissioner or as former superintendent Chris Marr, who sent his children to Providence Public Schools. When I became a dad, but happy Father's Day to all the dads in here, by the way, and out there. When I became a dad, my first thought was, when he's school age, I have to move out of Providence. I just have to. And it feels, and I continue to feel like a coward ever since then. But the fact remains that working in the schools and so closely with the schools, I've just seen horror after horror after horror that I know that I would be a monster to subject my own son to. You know what I mean? And I feel bad that other people have to, and other people don't have the luxury that I had to be able to move outside of Providence. Um, but there's no way that given a chance, given a choice, I would send my son to a school in Providence. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think it's really sad. But I have seen students, not heard of. This isn't like secondhand information. I've seen students reporting rapes. I've seen students reporting misconduct by teachers in very inappropriate ways. And I've seen teachers firsthand call students the N-word. And the systemic racism that's happening is not only targeting the children, but it's also a problem for why we can't have representation from our teachers in the schools. And by that, I mean racial representation, because I've run into a lot of teachers who are doing amazing work. But what happens is the great young teachers who come in, who are people of color, get eaten alive in the system. One of the schools that I'm working very closely with, I watched the evaluations for probably in the top 3 teachers in the school, definitely in my top 10 in the state, right? Like one of those teachers just get horrible evaluations. Meanwhile, a white person who's actually studying to be a teacher is getting like these great, is getting these great evaluations, and there's no real balance there. So I'm struggling with that. There's 2 more things, Bill, that I wanted to point out that you had referenced. It's been a year. Yes, it has been a year. The John Hopkins report came out a year ago this week on June 19th, 2019, which makes me wonder about the timing, right? Like, was this intentionally like 1 year later, we're going to roll out and release this? Because they've done it in a tiered approach this week with town hall meetings. I've had students participate in town hall meetings this week with the state. So I found that interesting. But the other thing that I find interesting, if we're talking about the longevity of somebody who we believe in Angelica Infante Green. She came in on our podcast, and it meant a great deal to the students, looked the students in the eye and said, here's what I'm planning to do. I believe in her, but I've also seen that rotating door, not only of administrators in the building, but of superintendents and commissioners. And that seems to be more political, right? Like new mayors for the city usually bring in their new superintendent target. And the same thing at the state level. Not always, but oftentimes that's usually the case. They come in with their plan and they come in with their people. So that's just something that I'm worried about too. I'm worried about representation is important. We know that, and we're chasing amazing teachers out of the system. I'm worried about some of the powers that Pat referred to of the union, because there are so many great teachers, but there's also so many bad teachers that really are overpowered in some ways. I respect the teachers union, and I'm just wishing that there was a little bit more balance there, but also the longevity of some of these great people who come in with great plans, like Infante Green.
If I could just jump in for a second, you had kind of tickled my memory when you talked about teachers and leaders who send their kids to public schools. I'm referencing an Ian Dennis article on the Public's Radio, and it goes back to last November, so it's relatively recent. And he actually asked that very question. He points out Ms. LaFortune, who is in the Providence City Council, her children, one child goes to classical and one child goes to Vartan Gregorian. My understanding, by the way, is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that Vartan Gregorian is probably the best primary school in the city. But she sends her children to Providence schools. Interestingly enough, Angelica Infante Green announced, now this is back in November, so there is a date period here, that, and this is public information from your public radio, her son is on the autism spectrum and goes to the private Wolf School, which, by the way, is one of the great schools in the country for children who are immersed in that issue. Her daughter attends the Gordon School over in East Providence, which is Again, an amazing school at an amazing price. Just a couple other that just bear mention. I couldn't go an entire show without taking some sort of cheap shot at our governor, and so I won't. I'll keep the streak going here. One of her children. Let me scroll down here. The miracle of live radio here. Her children. One of her children goes to. Oh my goodness! I'm sorry. Both of her children go to private schools. Okay, here we go. Her daughter Cece, and I only mention these names, by the way. I'm not a big fan of discussing people's children, but the governor, perhaps unlike no other leader in the state, has used her children as political props in so many ways, in so many ads, and in so many political situations. Anyway, Cece goes to LaSalle, and her son Tommy goes to Hamilton, part of the private Wheeler School, since it helps him with his dyslexia. Now, there's a point to this, by the way, and I'm just going to throw this out there, and this is one of the things that we should tackle in a future show on Rhode Island schools. Dyslexia, full disclosure, my wife has advanced degrees and advanced certification in dyslexia, so it's something that's talked about more often in our house than most. There are mandates in state education formulas on how to provide the adequate resources to attack dyslexia at a very young age. And I'll just sum this up. Someone I know who's something of a local expert and advocate on dyslexia, Jody Stone, talks about the importance of being able to read. Now, obvious, right? She talks about in the first and second grade, you learn to read, and then after third grade and afterwards, you read to learn. So that if, in fact, dyslexia is not attacked, and I use that intentionally, at the primary level, very often children, I don't want to say are lost, but are presented with a lifetime of challenges that requires a heavier degree of intervention. And dyslexia can be overcome. There are a variety of methods. And by the way, some of the prep schools in this town, ironically, are leaders in dealing with that. In fact, the aforementioned school that the governor sends her son to. So it's a mixed bag, but I think it's clear that public education is for thee, not for me, when it comes to the leadership of this state. And they're all ready to go to the ramparts to support it until, ruh-roh, it's my kiddo. And by the way, Roberta, I will never, unless you're Gina Raimondo, I will never attack anyone for simply, I will always support them, in fact, for getting the very best that they can for their children. That is... I still have mixed feelings. You know, I have mixed feelings about it, but I promise you that a bulk of my work has been focused and centralized around the area that I grew up in, Washington Park in Providence, to actually give back to that community and start to try to tip the balance more in the students' favor. But I honestly, I do regret it because I am taking advantage of a privilege that I have. You know what I mean? In doing so. So it's tricky. Really let me jump in there for a second. Don't ever apologize for doing the very best for your children. The very best thing that could happen to your children, and to a degree it's already happening to mine, is that life brought them opportunities that they were able to take advantage of in education. And both you and at some point, I firmly believe your children growing up around you will then take those advantages and leverage them massively on the very problems that they were able to escape. And that is the very best thing that someone can do for their community. Take advantage of every opportunity, but at the same time, as you have, come back and just invest everything into making it better for other people. Since this is our Father's Day show, effectively,
so Roberto,
happy Father's
Day. Just to add something, Roberto. So, you know, I think at the end of the day, I mean, you're in the battle, right? And being in the battle, I think it's important, and it's a fact, right? We take it personal, and in personalizing it, you know, I think it's inevitable that if your goal is to make a positive impact and improve something, then it's almost like that moment of self-reflection, right? Have you accomplished the goal that you set out? And if you did accomplish it, then why wouldn't that be good enough, right, for the people in your life? Or maybe you're not completely at the goal, right? And it's that struggle, right? What is enough and what is good enough for the people in the community as well as the people that we love? So, you know, I think that everyone on this call, right, that constantly battles and constantly, brings issues to light that others don't want to bring to light, one way or the other, we're probably all finding ourselves in these kind of moments, right? Of, what is right, what is not right. At what point are we privileged with just information that others don't have, and what do we do with it? So to kind of take everything we've talked about here and to make a bit of a transition with it, which I wanted to bring up the allocation of resources for COVID-19 preparation within schools. We had the opportunity within the Equity Council meetings, Roberto, that we both, we both serve on, to hear from the contact tracing work stream, the testing work stream. Now, these are work streams that could dissolve in the next couple of months, right? These are groups of people that are being brought together from different state departments, and they're working as a kind of coalition to create programs around contact tracing as well as testing. Now, in speaking with these groups, we've identified some interesting gaps, right? Areas where we don't necessarily have sufficient operational capacity to provide and support Rhode Island communities, especially those that are most at risk and those that are most impacted by COVID-19, like Providence, Central Falls, Pawtucket, and other communities that are starting now to see, or we're starting to see more of an incidence. So, with the contact tracing, we don't have resource coordinator capacity. So in other words, people that are isolated and quarantined will not necessarily have easy access to having people bring them food. So they're piecemealing resources together, but it's not like a massive infrastructure that can ensure that food is supplied to hundreds or thousands of people if they were infected, right? And that's the type of infrastructure you want to be confident about our capacity to mitigate the spread and to also, save lives. And then when we think about that, that's one issue. The second issue is the National Guard's going to get pulled out from the contact tracing force in July, which leaves a big staff gap in the state's ability, right, to actually supply the amount of contact tracers, people that are making phone calls, that the National Guard was previously supplying. Now, the testing stream is another issue. So I'm kind of trying to build out here so that people know what's really going on. Not what you're hearing in press conferences, which I always try to say they're in a great place, but what's really going on. So with the testing stream, here's the fact. The fact is that the people in the testing stream understand that CVS's testing system is not very sensitive. The error rate is higher, but you can do it faster because you're collecting samples from the lower part of the nose, right? So because of speed, they've sacrificed quality. And that's been an intentional decision that has been made in order just to get more people tested. Understanding that up to 50% of the people tested with CVS's Abbott kit, diagnostic test, what could essentially be walking away from that test thinking that they're negative when in fact they are positive. So that's a pretty high number. Now, what's the challenge with that is that we have that information. So why aren't we creating more testing sites and more capacity to have the testing kit that essentially puts the swab deeper into your nose? They call that nasopharyngeal, because the sensitivity is higher, the error rate's lower. And while you might have to wait 2 to 3 days to get the results back because they have to send it to a lab, the likelihood is you have a greater chance of knowing with a little more certainty whether you're positive, right? So that's important. Now, why is it important? It's important because they understand that we're sacrificing some error rate, like we're taking on more risk. And yet when the governor reports that we've done enough testing that we've covered 20% of the population, if you correct that by saying, well, because of the error rate, that number may not be that, the number of people we've tested may not be successful tests, right? The test may have had error rates. So are we truly at 20%? If you're thinking in an ideal picture, the optimal world, are we there? The fact is we're not there. Now, what am I building towards? This is what I'm building towards. All of this becomes much more important when we think about children, right? So what happens when we open our schools up? How will we test our children? How will we ensure that we're doing enough tests in sequence to overcome the possibility of their getting a test that has an error, right? How are we making sure that we're capturing positive cases of children, seeing that we have an increased risk of children being infected? So that was a question that we posed to the testing stream, and they did not have a program, right? They do not have a program. They do not have a legitimate process ready to prepare for pediatric testing, given that schools are opening. Now, that's concerning for two reasons. If you don't have a program, then you don't know how much it costs. And if you don't know how much it costs operationally, then you will not be allocating funds towards something that you don't have a budget line for. And so here we have over $40 million that are supposed to be allocated to schools for COVID-19 preparation. Now, we know that if it's an equitable funding formula, most of that money should be going to schools that are in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. But if we don't have an understanding of what level of funding we need for pediatric testing, then how are we going to allocate those funds? The fact is, it won't happen. So two problems. The Department of Education has not talked about what funding formula for those resources will look like, one. And two, the testing stream team has not determined a program or a process, therefore the cost associated with pediatric testing. So where are we? We're 2 months away from schools opening, less than that. And we have nothing to show in terms of preparing our children for COVID-19 and actually creating a budget line item that we can fund in an equitable way. So I just want to throw that out there as a transition, as a bridge between these two worlds that we're confronted with right at this point in time, which is education and the disparities that exist, and COVID-19 and the inequities that exist in healthcare access. So I'll just put it out there now and love to get your thoughts, guys.
Well,
Yeah,
okay.
look,
Go ahead, Bill.
The reality is that pediatric testing is extremely low. In fact, I think we're talking less than 10% of all total tests are pediatric. In fact, I know that because I asked the commissioner that the other day. The director of the Department of Health, Dr. Nicole Alexander Scott. I asked her that the other day. And look, we don't really have a firm grasp on, from a funding stream perspective, from just a basic, gut instinct perspective, how this is going to play out when we hit that August 31st mark. But one thing that's interesting, as I asked Commissioner Infante Green today during that same Providence turnaround press conference, how are you going to marry what happens in an East Greenwich, what happens in a Barrington, with what happens in a Rogers High School and a Providence public school and what happens in Central Falls? How are you going to not only get on the same calendar page, but what's the response look like? What does that team look like? Are we talking about National Guard soldiers? Are we talking about medical personnel? Are we talking about Brown med students? I mean, what are the mechanics for mitigating a COVID outbreak? And I didn't ask her this specifically, but I'm implying, what are the mechanics for mitigating a COVID outbreak in any given public school? Is it up to school nurse teachers, which, by the way, in Central Falls, they're basically almost entirely cut at this point? So those are the questions that are so obvious, and really to no fault of their own at this point, as far as the Commissioner of Education. I don't think the Department of Health has put an adequate infrastructure together to address those, exactly what you raised, Doctor, those questions that you raised.
And just to add on, Bill, I mean, it was 10%, but we also have to recognize that we were in a pseudo quarantine phase, right? I mean, children were not going to parks. They were not going to amusement parks. They were not going to school. And so that rate is contextually it makes sense, but that context is changing. And as schools open, it will change quickly. Pat, you had some thoughts? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd like to understand fully what's going on in the daycare, particularly the older daycare centers. When I say older daycare, I mean not just bitty babies, but young toddlers, pre-K. What's going to be done there? Because that's one of the environments where children, they're not desk bound. You're herding cats. You're talking about coming from all sorts of communities into one condensed, very intense environment. And clearly parents are at their wits' end. I mean, parents are not able, most of them financially, to not go to work anymore. And as the twin devil here, as we quote unquote normalize, as we rush to normalize, and I use the term rush intentionally, kids are going to go back to daycare. and what this immunity or lack of immunity to this disease is going to portend for the families then they go back to at home every day. A diverse, largely uncontrollable population acting in small, intimate situations without the ability to control them in desks and things like that. Number two, how is it we don't know this at this point? I mean, for the love of God, this is, on my outrage, I'm going to talk about my first appearance at a Gina Raimondo press conference. But all of this just strikes me as someone who hasn't been as intimately involved as you folks have been, as just a gigantic show put on. It just appears to me there's so much conversation and so little action and so little communication with the citizenry. It's appalling. There are 60 days left till children go back to school. 60 days. We don't have busing worked out. We don't have classroom schedules worked out. We don't have really an understanding of the daycare situation truly worked out. We don't have nothing. And this has been going on for months.
Yeah, I mean, we're losing principals in time. Yeah, we're losing principals in a time, or principals are being fired in a time where schools are supposed to present plans, right? I mean, this is, it just, to your point, Pat, it doesn't make sense. And I think this administration has not necessarily struggled with big vision, but I think anyone can develop a big vision. I mean, there are millions of entrepreneurs that do it every day, but how do you execute on that vision, right? What kind of operational path do you take, and can you execute on that operational plan that you've developed? And with this administration, I think the answer is, for the most part, been no, or maybe halfway. But with this crisis, we can't afford halfway anymore. And so, Roberto, what are your thoughts? What's your perspective on everything?
You just mentioned how we're losing principals in this time of crisis. Nicole Mathis is one of the best principals that we had in Providence. I mean, just talk to some of the students at Mount Pleasant, or some of her previous students at Nathaniel Green, or many of the other places that she's been and rotated like a lot of the other administrators do, because of our weird system here in PPSD. So I have a lot of concerns about that. I asked the mayor the other day, and my one chance to talk to him the other day, and I got shut down on that real quick, that he didn't know, which I found super interesting. I was like, that's interesting, because it's all over the newspaper and stuff. Like, it's not hard to miss. It's in your city. But also Superintendent Peters gave he did a little bit of a press conference, or a Q&A session about a week ago, so that he could discuss the August 31st reopening. And they laid out the plan to reopen, which is really like the skeletal structure of a plan with no meat. There's no meat in there. So what I found interesting was the idea to come in, and the idea that he's opening it up to questions, when the answer to every question is, I do not know.
Roberto, let me jump in? Can I ask you a question? You're intimately involved in the operations of the city of Providence in so many different ways, that someone like me, who lives out in the burbs, in the most in a community known for being a bedroom community. I live in Cumberland. Is Mayor Alorza as hopelessly out of touch with the city he purportedly runs as it seems?
No, I don't think so. It's funny, because he and I went to high school together, and I have a love/adversarial relationship with him in high school and ever since. And I continue to disagree with some of his policies, but it's not at the level of where our governor really offended me in the past couple of weeks on multiple different occasions in multiple different. With Mayor Lorza, I find a lot more reason, and I find a lot more opportunity to get to some truths. I didn't the other day. The forum wasn't the appropriate place for me to have a sidebar with him on it. But I wish I had an opportunity. Here's another example. and this is just how silly politics get in Providence. And I want to be mindful of the time. I certainly want to bring up exit interviews. Please, somebody ask me about that in a second. But Dr. Munoz and I have a mutual friend, Kobe Dennis, who's one of the community leaders in Providence, and Kobe's a funny guy. Kobe's a super interesting guy. And when Kobe was running for mayor against Elorza, there became a controversy because Elorza had a Wu-Tang album out on his desk behind him where he gave a press conference one day. And a lot of the response was that he was just pandering to the Black community. And I could tell you that going back to high school, no, Elorza loves Wu-Tang. Like it is what it is, right? But then that led to Kobe Dennis challenging him to a rap battle, I believe. And this is for the stake of our city. This is for leadership of our city. So Kobe released a music video, and I thought Elorza would be above it, but Travis Escobar, who was on his team, I think I could be wrong, but I want to credit Travis. Where they responded with a mixtape, and I don't know what the hell is going on. So no, that doesn't look good when it comes to your question, Pat. But I can tell you that beneath that, he has evolved a lot since high school in some very major ways. In a lot of corporate ways that I kind of don't like. You know what I mean? You want to rub your people. You want your people to still, represent the hood. And he's definitely a lot more corporate. He's definitely a lot more likely to shake hands of the movers and shakers in the room than some of my students. But I do find him reasonable and thoughtful when it comes to governing. I could be wrong. I'm sure there's going to be some examples where I highly disagree, and I can actually probably list some.
Well,
there was something else I wanted.
Let me just jump in real quick.
Go ahead.
Was the Wu-Tang album, was it in fact a copy of Once Upon a Time in Shaolin?
It was Enter the 36 Chambers. I hate that I know that.
Look, I'll say this real quick as well. I think Mayor Elorza is easily the most, the victim of the most undeserved hypercriticism in Rhode Island politics when you're talking about talk radio fodder and so on and so forth. Providence politics is a unique beast. I've been here for 2 years and I've studied it my whole life. From the outside looking in, and to navigate, what happens in Fox Point is a lot different than what happens on Cranston Street, and it's a lot different than what happens on outside Billy Taylor Park or wherever. And I think you're absolutely right, Roberto, that he bites that corporate apple a bit. That rubs some people the wrong way. Some people don't like that he, in my opinion, is a leader on certain things. For example, I think the Baby Omar controversy is one of the silliest,
absolutely
most ridiculous, almost pathetic talk radio controversies out there. I think it's great that he has his child there with him. There are times I've been at press conferences where it's been disruptive. The staff always comes in, Emily Ward, Patty Sakoshes, they always come in and deal with it. It's never been a problem. Except for one Zoom call that, I think that there's a lot of the Mayor Aloha thing. Look, the guy had an opportunity to be in Hawaii with Pete Buttigieg. That's what politicians do. That's advancing potentially his own agenda, but also, that makes potentially him have a perspective that's a bit more national, which isn't a bad thing. So, look, there are mistakes along the way for any politician, but my wife can't stand the fact that he crushes people's dirt bikes when they finds people with an illegal dirt bike. You know what I mean? You'll always find someone to pick a bone, but I think it's outrageous how much people give him a hard time. I think it's childish and inappropriate.
Well, Bill, Bill, go ahead, Doctor.
Well, Pat, So, I want to say this, and then I think we should get to the, again, what's outraging us and what are our next steps. Just because of time. Now, I do want to add a point, since we've all seemed to have some takes on the Providence mayor. My take is not that he's not well intentioned. Is not that he's not the way he's handled certain crises has not been well. A good approach. I would say a tempered approach. That's probably the word I would use in many instances. My concern is that he does play establishment politics. And we've seen what establishment politics has driven other, individuals that are supposed to represent communities of color, urban core communities, has kind of led them down a different path, right? I mean, we see it in the criminal justice system. We see a lot of things happening. So while Elorza, tends to call things out, and the press conferences seem to incite some controversy at times, I've also seen him play politics. I've seen him not necessarily create programmatic change. Even Providence Plantations. Look, I mean, he could have taken it off. He could have taken plantations off the documentation 2 years into his term, right? I mean, ultimately, I think that that's the type of boldness I would have liked to see. That's the type of boldness where I could stand here and not have any criticism. But I didn't see that, and I often do see him play the same politics that Gina Raimunda plays. And so, from my perspective, that kind of reaction.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that at all, and I just think that a lot, quickly, I just think that he has become in the statewide conversation, a lot of people, he's kind of become a caricature that he's some kind of doofus, that doesn't know what he's doing, that he's lost total control of the city, that when in reality, I think that exactly as you stated, Dr. Roberto, that he's playing establishment politics. That's the criticism you should be looking at, not the fact that he's got his kid with him at a press conference, or a Wu-Tang record on the mantle in his office.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would bring my daughter. I mean, you want your child to understand what you're doing on a daily basis when you barely see them, especially.
Right. If I may, you bring up a really good point, though. That between his and I, our mutual friends are a killer blue gang in Providence. And I'm talking about people who I have really high respect for, people who I really, really like in Providence, on our city council and on his team. There is a very vicious blue gang. You have to vote down the blue line. These are the people that you're going to vote for. And they can be pretty tough with it. And I think that's a lot of what this show, a lot of what your ideals, a lot of what Pat's ideals, from what I know about Pat, it's in spite of those ideals. And I feel that leaves a lot to be desired.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Roberto, for mentioning that. So I think that's a great segue, right? In terms of really addressing, let's address our outrage, right? We can do that in a tempered way, just to reflect some of our political leaders, if you want, or in a non-tempered way. So we'll switch it up today a little. We'll start with Pat. We'll go on after Pat to Roberto, then Bill, and then I'll close up the show. So you want to start, Pat?
Absolutely. I've been waiting for this. All right. So one of our co-show residents here was a witness to this. I went to my very first Gina Raimondo press conference. And since this is family radio, the most polite term I can come up with is underwhelmed. Holy cow. First of all, let's talk about the setting. You've got the three dear leaders standing up there at attention with a properly consulted gaze, all the right clothing, looking firmly in control. Let's talk about the sound. How is it possible that we are conducting a press conference in arguably one of the finer concert halls in New England, the home of the Rhode Island Philharmonic, and yet it is deliberately, in my mind, it's the only way, I can't imagine professionals would do this, mic'd up so that when you listen to the recording, you hear the muffled tone of the voice of the people asking questions, so you really can't understand what they're saying, and then you've got Gina standing there forthright, looking into the face of challenge, and saying nothing. How is it possible? How many months are we into this where members of the mainstream media, and I'm not one of those mainstream media conspiracy theorist types, I think frankly a lot of them are just lazy, are still asking questions like, how many people can sit in a row in a hexagon, all right, and still be representative of your desires with regard to social distancing, when in fact the city and the state are in financial meltdown? How is that possible? I'm not sure. I mean, do we have a working media in this town? What passed for questions from the establishment media, and Bill, maybe that was just the wrong one to go to. Maybe all the superstars didn't work both like you did, and were sitting there having having the catered takeout up at the park, getting ready to talk about the Providence plantations. Thoroughly underwhelmed. I asked a question, my first time there. Yeah, my question was a little wordy. But for her to stand there and act like she couldn't hear it, oh, come on, Governor Raimondo. Well, I've got a special surprise for the next one. I'm going to be prepared this time for hearing problems. And I am going to go back. And what was even more breathtaking was your special buddy, Dan York, hearing that someone had pierced the world of Rhode Island establishment media. Someone who's a blogger with 32 Facebook followers had gone and asked a question. And he blustered about until he realized that same person was on hold waiting to talk to him on his show. And for the record, for anyone who listened to both or listened to the show, understand that the Coalition Talk Radio has 20 times more Twitter followers than Dan York's State of Mind, his experiment in indie media. All right. And I don't even know. I can't even calculate the difference in Facebook followers. But truly, his reaction, I don't think he really realized it was me yet, and then he started to temper it. Not that I'm important, but I call the show. But what was astonishing was the arrogance towards independent media. The notion that somehow they just know better than we do. Yeah, okay. Whatever. That's why everything's great here. Nothing needs to be fixed. And the media is right on top of things. I'm sorry. That was my outreach of the week.
Thanks for sharing, Pat. And, just to build on that, Dan York was the guy when I did my first interview when announcing for governor. He said, "Wow, you're articulate." You know what that meant, right? You're articulate because you're from Central Falls. I mean, it's interesting. You're articulate. So that's the guy that Pat is referencing. So just to put some context behind it. All right. So great. Thank you, Pat. Now we're going to move on to Roberto.
Thank you for being so articulate, Dr. Munoz. Anybody who doesn't realize that you're articulate, I think, wouldn't have those expectations of a Puerto Rican. And that's what I've encountered so many times in my life. Like we're talking about what's grinding my gears right now. That's been grinding my gears my whole life. But something that I'm struggling with this week particularly, I'm so sad at some of the amazing opportunities that the Steambox youth have had. We had one of our favorite rappers. We just found out when we finally got to meet them at the Penny Arcade Expo is a professor at Brown. And so they are right here in the state. And we started talking and we started coming up with all these ideas to collaborate. And we were going to have our favorite rapper working with us. You know what I mean? As we were about to go into Canada and tour with our podcast, talking about immigration and healthcare. But I'm sorry, where I'm going with this is one of the opportunities that we pivoted to doing everything digital. We have among those friends who are rappers, comic book writers, all of this stuff. One of our friends knows one of the guys who made Enter the Spider-Verse. He did the audio on Enter the Spider-Verse. I can't tell you how much of a special movie that is to me, because now you have Spider-Man, which is my favorite thing in the world, who's half Puerto Rican, right? Like I can truly identify with my lifelong hero. And it meant the same thing to so many of my students. It was truly a special movie. But what I'm finding is, so our students interacted. We watched the movie together online, digitally. They interacted, and the actual directors jumped in, and some of the stars of the movie jumped in on Twitter and were handling personal questions from the students, which was really cool. That movie stars Shamik Moore, and here's the unfortunate part. The unfortunate part is cancel culture, and my own insistence upon it. I gave up Bill Cosby a long time ago. Because Bill Cosby is a nasty POS, in my opinion. Looking down on and referring poorly to other people of color because he made it, because he elevated his status. He can look down on the rest of us. And R. Kelly a long time ago, right? I didn't need news cycles to tell me to cancel them. But Shamik Moore was answering their questions, and a week after, Shamik Moore says that Rosa Parks should have took a cab when all of these racial things started coming out. And it was one of the grossest things that I could hear from a black person, right? Like, it was just, when it comes from people of color, as a person of color, as a Latino, when I hear other people of color just say ridiculous, gross things like that, like, now Enter the Spider-Verse is tainted for me. Like, I kind of want, like, get a new Spider-Man for the next one. I don't insist upon it. He's not Bill Cosby to me yet. He's not R. Kelly. He hasn't done anything like that. He just said something really ignorant, and it makes me sad. But here's where I want to refer to all of you, and to any of our listeners. I'm wondering, how much is too much? When is over the edge? When can't somebody take something back? Because I'm looking forward to a lot of people who are saying really stupid things in my life right now in this time. I'm looking forward to them having an opportunity to redeem themselves and to evolve moving forward. It might be it might be a rhetorical question, but that's what I'm wrestling with today.
I appreciate that, Berto. I mean, it's like we have to be careful in creating our own prisons, right? I mean, if we create a culture that we can't grow from, then we're doing the same thing the colonizers did. So that's deep, though. You drew us pretty deep, Roberto. So we'll take that, and we'll hand it back. We'll hand it off to Bill now.
Yeah, I'm just amazed that there are people out there in Rhode Island that are strongly opposed to changing the name of the state to remove Providence plantations. And I'm a part of a working group that is kind of trying to piece together, sort of a media campaign, if you will, in terms of how to work with these people. Last night, Sal Montero, someone who I have just an unbelievable amount of respect for, brought up something really fascinating, that when it comes to a campaign where you're trying to convince people out there who genuinely don't want to have any sort of empathy or understanding for anyone besides themselves about why they should act on something. Sal brought up a great point, Sal from the Nonviolence Institute, that, if you think of people like the fuel tank, empty to full, when you're looking at that fuel tank, if a person falls into that empty category, you know what I mean? There's almost no point in trying to work on them. Focus on the people who are kind of half full and bring them over. And I agree with that completely. But at the same time, I see so many posts and hear so many talk radio calls from people, here's one. This guy's a Westerly Town Council person, Caswell Cook. He writes, yeah, just leave the effing statues alone, knock it off, find something else to complain about. To the victor go the spoils. You could rewrite all of history, the entire world, riffing on why we shouldn't change the name of the state. Here's someone who posted, keep giving, this is a Sean Antaya on Facebook, keep giving these Black Lives Matter thugs, and U.S. history will no longer exist. They will rewrite history the way they want it to be taught. Maybe we should stop protesting because they're the only ones to have black colleges, all black scholarships, all black entertainment channels. And if we did that, we'd be racist. Maybe we need to put it into everything that they have. So these are Rhode Islanders. I know everybody knows that they grew up in the woods like I did, out in Charahoe, that Rhode Island is extremely racist. I come from a family that's multiracial family. Just this past weekend, my wife, who is Latinx, was the victim of an online racist attack that went on for quite some time and really became just incredibly racist by someone from Newport. So Rhode Island's filled with racist morons. That outrages me. And I think they're in the empty tank, and I don't think there's any point in trying to convince them to change the name of the state. It's really made me rethink tactically how to approach things over the last few weeks. If you're such a fool that you're going to hold on to Providence plantations as part of the name of the state because you want to preserve history, I don't know if I have time for you anymore. I think I used to be more interested in having a dialogue with you, but now I'm wondering if there's any point to that. Dan Badandi, he and I blocked him this morning. He's this InfoWars Sandy Hook truther guy that lives in Rhode Island. He's, I think, from Central Falls, who, was pointing something out about the blacks when it comes to removing Providence plantations. Look, Providence plantations is number one, it's extremely offensive to a lot of people. Number two, the notion that it doesn't refer to Rhode Island's specific slave history, including the enslavement of indigenous people in the 1600s, by the way, who worked those plantations, and then the Narragansett planters of South County that built South County into the wealth that it is, Brown University, the Triangle Trade, all that. If you're so willing to ignore all of that, that you're just going to play ignorant and try to draw lines in the sand, no, I just don't have any interest in talking to you anymore, and I hope that you just fade away. That's all I have to say about it now.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like if I could kind of just rehash what I said last week and with a different tone, and to kind of bridge what was said, especially what Roberto and Bill said, I'm outraged by the silent establishment, right? By the corporate liberals that take this opportunity to build their platforms, but would never sit down on a street corner and have a coffee with anyone from Southside. I'm outraged by the individuals that see this time that we're going through, and it excites them. It excites them because they, see an opportunity to elevate, their fundraiser, to elevate their candidate, and that's the first thought. And unfortunately, the truth is we can't read minds. So my outrage is probably not something that we could say is visible. We can't, filter it out from a scenery, from a crowd of 10,000, but it's out there. And I think that's what outrages me most, right? To know that it's out there, that there's no evidence that at least there's evidence through time, but in an instance, there's really no evidence, right? To be able to point out who those individuals are. Unfortunately, I think as in most of history, we identify after the fact, right? In retrospect, when we look back and say, well, who were the instigators? Who were those that incited, discord when we were attempting to seek out unity? Who wanted there to continue to be, debates about an issue when in fact, the community wanted to come together? Why are there divides between elders and youth in communities of color, right? What are the driving forces behind those divides? Are they job opportunities that are given to some and not others? Are they grant opportunities that are given to some and not others? So again, there's context there. There's ways of figuring out who those individuals are. But unfortunately, in this moment, it is not that easy. And so I sit back and I see a need for all of us to push forward and to continue to fight. And the truth is we find ourselves in a battlefield with tons of people around us. And you just don't know, right? You don't know who's actually willing to have your back and who's going to have the community's back. So that's what outrages me. There's not really a path in moving forward, except moving forward itself, and just figuring out, who's going to be, alongside you and alongside the community when all the media outlets stop reporting the injustices that we're seeing on a daily basis. So with that, I'd just like to thank you, gentlemen, again for bringing to light, all of the issues that Rhode Islanders are confronting, for lifting voices that are often unheard, for amplifying, many of the solutions that we need here in the state of Rhode Island, as well as many of the challenges that we have in getting there. So thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Pat. To everyone listening, this is Pump Up the Volume. Again, amplify community voices and the needs of communities, and again, communities that are often unheard. Join us again next week on Tuesday at about 7:30. And, we'll present again an overview of everything that's transpired over the next 7 days and our perspectives on those issues. So thanks again. Hope you have a great evening. Stay safe out there. Wear a mask and wash your hands. All right. Take care.